Hi gang, John O'Brien here. Week 6 of the clampdown. Hope you're doing well. It is working, okay? So here we are, Chautauqua County, under 30 reported cases of COVID-19. Keep up the good work, try to be patient, and remember we're all in this together. And you are in this with me tonight, or this morning, or whenever you're watching it, asynchronously, for Chapter 18. Okay, we finished Chapter 17. We're going to move on to societies in Sub-Saharan Africa, so Africa below the Sahara Desert. Please keep up on current events as well. Current depends on when you're watching this video, of course, right? So I'm doing this on April the 26th, and summer is coming. Can we keep our distance? Good question. We all want to be outside, but probably this is not a good scene in California, okay? All people on the beach coughing on one another and spreading coronavirus, right? New York probably going to start reopening soon, especially western New York areas, the less hard-hit areas. We need to be smart, right, or else the numbers will start spiking, and all of this clampdown will have been for nothing, okay? So we need to be careful. I think they're probably going to tell us once we can go back into society, continue to wear masks, wash hands, and take all those necessary precautions, okay? So a little bit of good news on the COVID-19 front, right? So you're living through historic times, right? We deal with history, and we tend to think that somehow we're separated from it, that we're just kind of watching it in a movie. No, history has changed, but it's also continuities, right? And we're connected to what's gone before, even when this is kind of this is a brand new virus, right? But certainly we've seen pandemics before. Just 100 years ago, 1918, a little over 100 years ago, the great flu epidemic of 1918-1919 took tens of millions of lives worldwide. And the cities that practiced social distancing did much better than those that did not. Okay, that flu, it was a flu, H1N5, I believe, avian origin flu, essentially fizzled out because so many people had become sick, and many had died, right? When a pathogen's host dies, that's the person, the pathogen dies, cannot spread to someone else. So there was herd immunity, and enough people got sick and recovered, and enough people got sick and died that the pandemic of 1918-1919 had a very difficult time spreading, okay? Especially when people were practicing social distance, as we should be. Well, speaking of that, the great, at least hemispheric epidemic of the Black Death, right? Mid-1300s, Bubonic Plague. The rats that carried the fleas that carried the bacillus that caused the plague did not make it far north into Scandinavia. Imagine rats running through the snow, probably not, nor across the Great Sahara Desert. So the late 14th century was a time of cultural brilliance for societies of Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay? Well, let me just say one of many times of brilliance, okay, but especially brilliant because much of the rest of the Eastern Hemisphere, the Eurasian continent, was struggling to survive, okay, frankly, the Black Death. So we're going to move into Chapter 18 at this moment. This is us here, okay, so we'll do a couple different things here at once. There we go, okay. States and societies in Sub-Saharan Africa. So why don't we just say kingdoms? Well, in some parts of Sub-Saharan, below Sahara Africa, there were no well-defined nation states. People lived in social units, often at the village level. Villages of 100-200 people probably don't need a king, right? The grandparents are in charge and you follow their rules, right? So life can be beautiful, life can be based on morals and family and all those good things, right? And not need a large kingdom, all right? So we will have some nation states and other peoples living in societies, smaller societies. Africa, a continent of great diversity, climatically, socially, culturally. Please, folks, it's not a country and it never has been. You could fit the United States and China and most of Europe into Africa today. It's so large, okay? Google a map that does that. It's pretty interesting. Well back, over 1,000 years ago in history, people speaking Bantu languages from this region of West Africa migrated eastward and southward, especially following the rivers, taking their iron-making technology, their cattle breeding technologies, and their genes, G-E-N-E-S, right? Genetic material with them, and their languages, right? Core language, spreading through this part of Africa. Tough to go northward, right? That's the desert, and even 1,000 years ago it was desert. It was grown much since then through climate change, which has exacerbated desertification, right? So peoples living here moved eastward and southward, carrying their genes with them and their language, which would have been a root Bantu languages. So most of the languages below the Sahara, prior to the European incursion in the 19th century, were of Bantu origin. Okay, so the Bantu people would move into different regions of, well, especially when a village became somewhat overpopulated, move on. Right? Take your spouse, take a canoe, go down the river, take your iron-making technology with you, and spread your language, right? But also spread your genes, right? So people will intermarry, if I can use that term, those that they encountered, spreading their genetic material and their languages throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. Right? So what do I have here? Agriculture, you have farming, herding, especially cattle, iron, metallurgy, so that's iron making, most parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. That's before this course begins, folks, right? So a little background there, dating back at least 1,000 years. Okay, it's not supposed to do that. Okay. Early African migrations were necessary due to population growth. Population growth was fueled by better food, okay, as it generally is. Bananas, highly nutritious, right? You probably eat one every day. Coming from Southeast Asia into East Africa and spreading from there. Malay sailors, okay, bringing it in. Introduction of things like yams and chickens. Things with amino acids, proteins that sustain life, right? Sustain a population. So population increased. And again, going back before 1500 year, 400 BCE, there is no year zero. Who made this chart? Not I. Around the year 1, 800, and then boom, kind of taking off once these new foods are introduced. We will see that in reverse, so to speak. Well, actually, we already did, didn't we? Right, in our course. Soon after 1492, when Native American crops are taken and grown in Europe, Africa, and Asia, leading to population increase there. So, early African migrations, most of these societies will be kin-based. People are at least distantly related within these groups. Villages will be ruled by elders, so as I kind of facetiously said, grandma and grandpa are in charge of the villages, and they make sure everybody eats, okay? The land was held communally, so everybody, in a sense, shares. Not that it was some type of utopia, but there was a certain fairness. You didn't see these vast inequalities of wealth. Okay? Average population in the village, about 100. There's not a need for writing. If there are 100 people in your village, and if you all kind of graduate, the people your age kind of graduate together, right? They're in the class of 2020. Well, think about that. You guys are in the class of 2020. It sucks, frankly, right? You're not going to be able to go to graduation. You're missing out on some things, campus life. But that's going to shape the character of your cohort, right? So in these African villages, all of the young people, let's say turning 14 that year, would go through initiation rites at the same time. That would be called an age grade system, like the class of 2020 or the class of 1020, okay? And they essentially kept an eye on one another, right? Don't bring dishonor to our group, to our age grade, as I would call it, right? And again, with the grandfathers for the most part in charge, these are fairly stable societies, right? Fairly stable societies. Well, until population goes up, I guess we should say, to flash forward. As population grows, there's competition for resources, competition for land. Right? Maybe you can go down the river taking your language and genes with you, but there's going to be some competition, especially here in West Africa, some disputes, and gradually some of these societies, these villages coalesce into what we call kingdoms. Here in Benin, for example, the people of Benin did not leave us writing, but they left us really exquisite bronze castings, bronze sculpture that tell the story of their people. From across the desert, after about the year 750, we will have Berber, and that's an ethnic group. Berber, North African people who converted to Islam Islam coming across the desert with these icons mean camels. Camels didn't originate in Africa. They were brought into North Africa from Arabia by these Muslim tradesmen. They tended not to be Arab. Some of them could be. They tended to be North Africans who had converted to Islam and make that trek across the Sahara to trade what? Yes, you in the back row. To bring in salt. What? And bring out gold. Weird, right? Salt for gold. Anybody want to do that? Probably not, right? We all have enough salt. In fact, we have too much of it. So look at the labels of what you're eating, especially now that we're kind of clamped down on eating a lot of processed food, way too much salt. But if you're in a tropical climate and there's perspiration and there's not a lot of natural salt in the diet, you need salt to live. I mean, we need salt to keep our heart beating rhythmically. Don't take too much salt, and that's why too much salt is dangerous, right? Too much potassium as well. Things have to be kept in balance. So Berbers would bring the salt into West Africa and take gold back to North Africa, where it could be sold in Europe or in the Middle East. From time to time, elephant tusks, ivory, and also enslaved people would be traded for salt. You got to imagine that there were not a lot of people enslaved, right? You need to get the enslaved people across the desert from this region way back to the Mediterranean coast. Okay? You can't bring a lot of people. You need to hydrate them. You need to transport them. So what that meant in a very perverse way, a very warped way, was that enslaved people from Sub-Saharan Africa were seen as rare. And it's awful to talk about people this way. But because they looked, frankly, different than the people of the Balkan Peninsula, Slavic people, slaves, Slavic, right, who were light-skinned. Your enslaved person, which is now what we call slaves, right, look different, must have come from far away, therefore you must be rich, because you can afford a slave who comes from far away. It's ridiculous stuff, it is perverse stuff to think about it this way today, but wealthy families in, let's say, Italy, might pick someone of a darker skin tone because that implied that the owner, the master, had greater wealth. And before we think that these unfortunates were picking cotton or something, I don't want to minimize the impact of slavery by any means, but it gets worse in time. We tend to think, oh, things always get better. No, slavery gets worse. For many enslaved people, let's say in Italy, who had come from Sub-Saharan Africa, or maybe had come from Eastern Europe, they were more akin to household servants, right? They didn't have freedom. Life sucked for them, all right? But they weren't, beaten to death, okay? They were serving the wealthy families like the Medici or the banking family of Italy as more or less as household servants. Okay? So slavery is awful, yes, but there are different degrees of it, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Yeah, he didn't bring a lot of people across the desert because it took like 3 months to cross it, even with these camels introduced. So trading communities are also introduced. So you're coming across the desert, it takes 2-3 months, you're going to stay here for a while. You might build a mosque. You might have an imam, if you're Muslim, right? Because you're going to be in that community. This is not a 9-to-5 job. Right? It's like 9 months there, 5 months somewhere else, that type of 9-to-5. So we will see the spread of Islam into West Africa, especially among the traders, the merchants. So if you're a Berber Muslim and you're bringing in these big blocks of salt on camels, and I'm giving you gold almost pound for pound, if I want to do more business with you, I might realize that it's advantageous if I kneel next to you at the mosque, right? If I convert to Islam. Or maybe you, if you're a male, you're a merchant, you're staying in my community for a while, you marry a local woman, and she's going to become Muslim, and the children will become Muslim. Okay? So Islam will spread, especially among the upper class of merchants and the rulers. So what we see here, as we've seen elsewhere, religions that brought in literacy are attractive to rulers who can't read or write. All right. So these new kings, so to speak, there had not been a real need for literacy in West Africa. Again, 100 people in your society. Who needs to read anything? You know the rules. But once kings start to put together kingdoms, they need to write stuff down. Okay. And Muslim merchants, if they could do anything, could write things down. Right. Here's your receipt for the gold. Okay. So merchants and monarchs in West Africa often converted to Islam. The people may not, right? The common people, so to speak, that's like me, right? Might have remained animistic, right? Belief in anima, belief in spirits of nature, spirits of the deceased. Not a highly organized or dogmatic faith. So that meant was, my king, my ruler, Mansa Musa, for example, we'll talk about in a moment, who might have converted to Islam, doesn't push it on me. There's an allowance for religious diversity that we're frankly not going to see in Europe at this time. Okay? So Kingdom of Ghana, here's an early one, kind of outside the parameters of our course. We started in 1500. Developed in West Africa in the 4th and 5th century. There is a modern Ghana today, but that dates to 1957 when a colony, a British colony in West Africa, went free and claimed the name Ghana. Okay? So, selling of gold, yes, okay. The gold, ivory, and slaves. I should just refrain from reading my notes here. Right? So kingdoms of the West, yeah, the Ghanese convert to Islam. That meant more trade across the desert, better relations with North Africa. The Islam in West Africa could assimilate with some local traditions. So there might have been an allowance in West Africa to a belief that the spirit of the dead still walked the earth. And sometimes needed to be placated. Like, hey, here, in honor of our deceased grandfather, we're going to put out a bowl of sorghum, a bowl of grain. Okay? Most subjects remain animist. Sundiata, Ghana was somewhat of a short-lived kingdom. A little bit further to the north and further west, we'll have the kingdom of, Mali, founded by Sundiata, that are there, if you can see it, means reigns, were in the early 13th century. It's a big kingdom, we'll call it an empire. It took over Ghana, and the rulers of Mali became quite wealthy because they taxed business. Unlike perhaps other countries, I'm just going to bite my tongue here, they give a lot of tax breaks to businesses. This nation taxed business and was able to generate profit, basically. The rulers were Muslim, at least nominally, but didn't force conversion. So we're looking here in purple. Right? It's probably a difficult map to see, but do a Google image search of Mali in the 13th century, M-A-L-I. Grandson of Sundiata, Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa Mali. That's how I learned this when I was much younger. Right? Here we are in the early 14th century. The reign is 1312 to 1337. Converted to Islam and became very devout. In fact, made the pilgrimage, the Hajj, to Mecca. Are you kidding me? Across the Sahara, along the southern rim of the Mediterranean, through Southwest Asia, into Arabia, deep into Arabia to Mecca, and return. And Mansa Musa apparently had all this gold, right? There's gold basically coming out of the ground in Mali. He's just kind of giving it away and building mosques and hospitals and soup kitchens and things all along the journey, so that people still talk today about that Hajj made back in 1325 by Mansa Musa. I think economists will also say that so much gold was kind of handed out that prices shot up, right? Because the gold became worth less than it had been. This is a map, Catalan Atlas, I believe it's called. This is a European map, but they don't know what's below this area, but they know there's some really rich guy with a lot of gold. Yeah, a lot of the gold ends up in Europe. I mean, the churches of Europe, the gilding of the churches of Europe built in this great Gothic era, I would guess, it's hard to prove this, had gold that came from Mali. Following the order of our textbook, Bentley, Ziegler, Salter, the turn next to deep South Africa, the great kingdom of Zimbabwe, about which, frankly, we don't know that much. Okay? Islam did not really penetrate into that region, thus there's no writing, but there were great stone cities and roads that connected to the coastline. So that on the coast of Africa, Muslim traders don't need just to